Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Karina Boycheva, and I'm an instructional designer and learning success manager at DQ. Joining me today is Lora Budzier, who is an accessibility project lead, and Paul Bowman, who is our director of training. Just a moment. Let's go ahead and take a look at our agenda here. We have a lot of great information to share with you today, and of course you will have access to this deck, and you're very welcome to reach out to us with any questions. So we'll take a look at what Section 508 is, including some important definitions and general requirements. We'll discuss the meaning of digital accessibility and why it matters to you. We'll go over the 508 refresh, including the WCAG 2.0 that are now incorporated by reference. Now, the new standards have some significant implications and will address how they fit into the approach of testing early and often to ensure accessibility. We'll also discuss how Section 508 applies to you, whether you are in the federal, EDU, or private sector. And the best part is that we'll do all this in just 5.5 hours. I'm just kidding, everyone. Nobody panic. We'll do this in just about 25 minutes. We'll address questions at the end, and we've also compiled some excellent resources for you as you are transitioning into compliance with the 508 refresh and the new standards. So, 508. This is a law that requires the federal government to provide access to its information and communication technology, also known as ICT, to people with disabilities. The law has a broad scope because ICT is an enormous category and includes all sorts of things that we'll discuss in a moment. The law applies to 4 categories: ICT that is procured, developed, used, or maintained by the federal government. Here's where we can see how broad the Section 508 scope is, just by looking at the definition of ICT. Directly from the text itself, the law states that ICT is information technology and other equipment, systems, technologies, or processes for which the principal function is the creation, manipulation, storage, display, receipt, or transmission of electronic data and information, as well as any associated content. Now, just to break it down a bit, the major categories are hardware, software, and electronic content. And all of these include both web-based and non-web-based technologies, and they do also include mobile technology and authoring tools. So you have things like websites, electronic documents, native mobile apps, computers, kiosks, and many others. This is just a very short list here to help illustrate. Now, given the broad scope of ICT, one of the most common questions is, are there exceptions? The answer is yes, and they are explicitly spelled out in the law. There are 6 exceptions which are listed on this slide. I'll just briefly go over 2 of them here. The first one is legacy ICT or safe harbor. This is ICT that complied with the original Section 508 standards, and it is documented that it complied, and it has not been changed on or after January 18th, 2018. But if any new portion is added after that date, the new part must comply with the new standard. The second exception I'll go over is best meets. Now, sometimes ICT that is fully compliant with Section 508 is not commercially available. And in this case, the agency must procure ICT that best meets both the Section 508 requirements and the business needs of the agency. Also note that the agency still has an obligation to provide access to the ICT to people with disabilities by alternative means that suit their needs. Now let's move on to discuss digital accessibility. So we know that Section 508 requires access to ICT, but what does access mean? It means that a wide variety of users, including people with disabilities, are able to access the technology. The goal of accessibility is to provide, as much as possible, independent access. For example, If you're a user who is blind, you don't want to depend on someone standing over your shoulder reading you the contents of a website. You want the website to be created in a way that allows your screen reader to access it. People with disabilities often access ICT in alternative ways using various tools. On this slide are listed just a few common assistive technologies, things like screen readers and magnifiers, refreshable braille displays, captioned phones, and of course there's hundreds of other examples. So now that we know what ICT is and what access to ICT means, let's ask the question, why should you care about accessibility? To begin with, it's the law. All federal agencies are required to comply with Section 508. And in addition, there are many other accessibility laws at the federal, state, and local levels. Beyond that, federal grant recipients and private entities doing business with the federal government are also impacted by accessibility requirements. And even when it's not the law, there are significant reasons to care. If you are a business, your customers with disabilities want accessible ICT. For example, you don't want a potential customer going to your website with a screen reader and maybe trying to put some items in the shopping cart only to find out that the process is not accessible. So they get frustrated and they give up and they go to your competitor. Customers with disabilities are not a tiny margin way off to the side there that you shouldn't worry about. About 20% of the US population has a disability, and people with disabilities have $490 billion in after-tax disposable income. So the bottom line is that if your ICT is not accessible, you are missing out on business. Going back to the legal side of things for a moment, it goes without saying that lawsuits are expensive. It can cost thousands of dollars simply to file a response to a complaint. So say you're formally accused of not being accessible. Even if you just want to say, no, we don't agree with you, and here's why. Well, that sentence might cost you $5,000. In 2017 alone, there were over 800 lawsuits related to website accessibility, and many of those are legitimate. But there's also a significant trend in what's known as drive-by demands and lawsuits. Unfortunately, there's a lack of clarity in some parts of accessibility law. And sometimes people use this gray area not for real advocacy, but to try to make a quick buck. The point here is that agencies and businesses are not immune to this type of attack. And whether or not they're truly at fault, it can get very expensive quickly. Now, to move on to a positive point on why you should care about accessibility, because it gives you a competitive advantage. It helps to think of accessibility as a business tool. If you're a federal contractor or vendor, you know that you have to provide Section 508 compliant ICT. It's very significant to note here that the US government is the single largest purchaser of ICT in the world. Because of this, we can see that Section 508 is really a driving force in accessible ICT in the entire world. Okay, now let's shift gears a little bit and talk about the 508 refresh. The original Section 508 was enacted in 1998. In the 20 years since then, of course, technology has changed drastically, especially the trend of converging technologies and multifunction devices. So now we have a phone that's not just a phone, but a computer, a camera, a video player, a music library, and we also have content that's shared across different platforms. And so the technical standards that we conceived of 20 years ago had become very outdated. In addition to this, there were a number of gaps in the original standards, for instance, relating to documents, site navigation, error validation, and others. So for all of these reasons, and also to align with industry and international standards, the 508 refresh was passed in 2017. Here we have a summary of the major changes in the refresh. Now, I won't go over all of them now, but I do want to highlight the first two specifically. In the new standards, the focus is on the functionality of the technology rather than the product type. Again, this is because we now have multifunction devices, and so this is a more flexible approach that will allow the standards to keep pace with evolving technologies. The next major change, and this is very significant, is that WCAG 2.0 Level A and AA success criteria have been explicitly incorporated by reference. Electronic content is required to meet these standards. They are international standards, and they are very carefully designed to ensure that success can be objectively measured. Here we have a quick bullet breakdown of how the old 508 standards compare to the WCAG 2.0 that are now incorporated by reference. The old standards were more static. Again, they were based on the product type, whereas the new standards are more flexible. The focus is on functionality and principles. The old standards had more gaps and gray areas, whereas the new standards are more complete and explicit. In the new standards, there are 38 success criteria for electronic content. And then you compare this to the old standards, there were only 22. So this means there are 16 rules that are either new or substantially changed. So what does this all mean? What implications do the 508 refresh and the new standards have? Well, firstly, there is a need for awareness. Is everyone at your agency or organization aware of these rule changes? If you are a manager or a leader, are you communicating these new requirements to all the relevant stakeholders? You're also looking at updating various agency policies and transitioning your practices to meet the new requirements. The good news is that there are many resources available to help agencies accomplish this, and we've compiled a great list at the end of this presentation. There's also a need for training. Are your procurement specialists trained in how to procure accessible ICT after the 508 refresh? What about your website developers and testers? How are they trained? They need to have knowledge of how to implement the WCAG 2.0 standards, ranging from a general familiarity to a highly technical proficiency. Along with that goes the need for validation and testing tools that are based on WCAG 2.0. There are automated tools available to test websites and applications during every stage of development. DQ has our own tools. Some of them are free and some of them are enterprise level. Other companies, of course, have their tools as well. And of course, there's the need for collaboration. Accessibility is a complex endeavor, and it relies on collaboration and communication. Especially, if you have a very large agency with thousands or even millions of employees, it's really critical to have effective collaboration. So by now, we're seeing that compliance with Section 508 is a significant venture. It doesn't happen magically, and it doesn't happen overnight. The best and most efficient compliance is to shift left. The shift left approach is centered on the idea of incorporating accessibility from the beginning, because thinking about accessibility at the end is expensive and difficult. So with shift left, you're really making accessibility a permanent and sustainable part of the workflow, and you're changing the work paradigm. The idea here is that you're preventing problems so that you don't have to waste resources trying to fix them later on. Let me share a really memorable example with you here. In 2016, UC Berkeley was sued for inaccessibility. Specifically, there were about 20,000 recorded online lectures that were open to students and the public, but they did not have captions. So the university decided that making them accessible would be too expensive. So in response, they simply removed public access to them. So it was just a lose situation for everybody. The university was slammed with a lawsuit. People with disabilities got the message that, hey, we're just not going to make this accessible, deal with it. And members of the public without disabilities that could previously access this open wealth of knowledge, well, now they can't. If the university had instead used the shift-left approach and had planned for accessibility to their videos from the very beginning, they could have avoided an issue like this. So this was an EDU example. Okay, but Section 508 actually explicitly requires that agencies determine in advance how users with disabilities will access the particular ICT. So again, here is where shift left ties in, because you're having to think proactively before something becomes a problem. Now let's get a little bit more specific and address how Section 508 applies to you specifically, whether you are a federal or EDU employee, a contractor or vendor, a developer or tester, or a procurement specialist. We'll go over some things that you should be thinking about with the 508 refresh and the new standards. All right, if you are a Section 508 program manager or other federal employee, one of the first things you can be thinking about is how to build awareness and support for the new requirements. And this includes making sure that employees understand how to play their part, and also having discussions between stakeholders to go over, what is the agency doing to comply? What steps are they taking? Are there any improvements to make, and so on. You've also likely started the process of updating your agency policies to reflect the refresh. And if you have not, now is the time. And if you don't have a Section 508 policy at all yet, now is the time. At the end of this presentation is a really great resource. It's called the Revised 508 Roadmap, which includes some great details on how to update your policies, including some sample policy language. You should also ensure that your websites adhere to WCAG 2.0. The documents you create need to be accessible according to the standards. These might be things like informational PDFs posted on the agency website, or forms that people need, and so on. Again, you can use various testing tools to ensure that your website and apps are compliant. There's also many opportunities to train your people. Lots of resources are available. For instance, we've just released an online course at DQ University that focuses on Section 508 and spells out the technical standards. Another important point is to think proactively. How will people with disabilities use your ICT? A recommendation for agencies is to create personas or test cases. For example, you have a hypothetical person, Jane, who has a cognitive disability. How will Jane access the agency website? Are there any roadblocks that she may encounter? How can they be removed? Now, let's move on to federal contractors and independent vendors. Probably a question on your mind is whether you need a new VPAT. The answer is maybe. Versions 2.0 and 2.1 are aligned with the refresh, but version 1 is not. However, be sure to check with the agency you're doing business with to see what their requirements or requests are. But if you are building entirely new ICT, or if your ICT is changing, then you should use the latest version, which is 2.1, and that is the one that's posted on the ITI website. If you do complete a VPAT, make sure that you have it readily available, and it's a best practice to have it posted on your website. And this is really critical, be sure to address how your particular product or service meets the standards. So rather than saying, yes, it meets this criteria and that criteria, explain also how it meets them. Of course, you want to make sure that your VPAT is accurate. If any inaccurate claims are made, this puts your company at serious risk. An agency may or may not check your VPAT claims, although they should. They may just take them at face value. However, they may and they should include language in the contract obligating the vendor to fix any accessibility issues if there are false claims. Okay, now moving on to EDU employees. You probably know already that public schools have accessibility requirements under the ADA. Here's an important note. Last year, the DOJ was considering setting WCAG 2.0 level AA as the standard in state and local government, which would of course affect publicly funded schools. But unfortunately, this initiative has been halted. However, it really illustrates that there is a drive to align institutions with global standards, so WCAG could in fact be incorporated in the future. So when you think about it, if you already have to be accessible under the ADA, why not be accessible using the WCAG standards, which would meet that portion of your ADA obligations? And it would also minimize your legal risk. Speaking of WCAG, many people wonder, well, where's the overlap? You know, if we follow WCAG 2.0, what's left to consider for Section 508? In a nutshell, WCAG 2.0 will cover your web content. To be Section 508 compliant, you then need to address everything else that falls under the definition of ICT that we covered earlier, and you also need to provide the appropriate documentation and support services for the ICT. So ask yourself, is your ICT accessible? Things like websites, documents, forms, mobile apps, lectures, and so on. Again, you can use various tools to test for accessibility, and I've underlined mobile apps here because it's an important one that's lagging behind. Okay, websites have received a lot of attention, but apps are not as accessible as they should be because they're kind of in a gray area. It's not spelled out in the ADA that applications must be accessible, but if they are not, this is a form of discrimination that the school is making, and you open yourself up to a potential lawsuit. Okay, considerations for developers and testers. As I mentioned before, plan on accessibility from the very beginning of the project. And keep in mind, again, there are various tools that you can use throughout the entire project lifecycle to test for accessibility. The idea is that you test early and test often, as we discussed before. This helps you to identify any issues early on and address them before they become enormous. All developers and testers should have a basic understanding of accessibility principles. And then, of course, some of these people will need to be experts and know all the technical details. I'll make a quick mention here. If you're a trusted tester listening in, you may be wondering if you need to update your certification. There are two important dates to keep in mind. First, if you're a trusted tester V3 that provides test results to any DHS agency, then you must obtain the V5 certification by April 1st, 2019. Second, starting on September 30th, 2019, V3 or V4 test results will no longer be accepted in DHS headquarters and DHS component government processes. So just keep those dates in mind if this applies to you. Okay, finally, let's turn our attention to procurement specialists. You may be aware that the FAR Council has not yet published guidance to reflect the refreshed changes. Nevertheless, agencies are still advised to align and update their procurement policies to reflect the new standards. There's a really comprehensive resource available on the section508.gov website that covers in detail what steps you should take to make sure that you're procuring accessible ICT. Another thing you should do is make sure that you verify the accessibility claims for any ICT. Even if there's a VPAT, be sure to do your own testing. And again, there are automated tools and manual techniques to do this. Keeping in line with that, it's also important to include language in your contract that specifies what happens if the ICT isn't actually compliant. Now, the specific language will depend on the situation, but for instance, you may say that the vendor will be required to replace or repair the non-compliant ICT at no cost to the agency. Okay, so with that final note, we're wrapping up the first portion of this webinar, and that brings us to the questions part. I know that we covered a lot of information here, and there are many things to think about, so please feel free to type in your questions to us, and we will address them.
Okay, great job, Karina. There have actually been some really good questions in the chat, and one of the questions that was just asked that Paul answered via the chat was whether the Section 508 is pointing to WCAG 2.0 or Section 508 and what the difference between the two were. And the answer is that Section 508 is the law and WCAG is the technical standard referenced by that law. So Section 508 used to have its own technical specification, but that's not the case anymore, as you mentioned, Karina. And now Section 508 references the WCAG standard instead. So that was something that was asked in the chat. I just wanted to make sure that was highlighted because Paul has been doing a rock star job of answering questions on the fly. So I just wanted to make sure that people saw that. So I guess let me take a look at some questions that we have here. Do you have, oh, go ahead, Paul. What was that, Paul?
Sorry, there's also the question about WCAG 2.1 versus 2.0.
Yes, do you want to touch on that?
Sure, or the basic idea is that the Section 508 standard references the 2.0 version of the technical standard. It does not reference the 2.1 version at this point. That could change at some point in the future, but right now you're required to abide by 2.0, not 2.1. That doesn't mean you can't do the 2.1. So if you choose to meet the 2.1 standard, then you'll be meeting the 2.0 standard by definition, and you'll be doing a little bit extra, which is a good thing, but it's not required.
Great, thank you. That is another good question that was asked that you answered, so thanks for touching on that. I have one here that asks, do you have any recommendations with regard to PDF content in general? Their current workflow involves a manual checker using a built-in accessibility checker in Adobe Acrobat. Are there any preemptive steps that can be taken to make PDFs more accessible, or any tools that we would recommend? And this especially relates to an EdEd institution.
So we actually have a very, very comprehensive course on making PDF files accessible. So that's one starting point that you can take a look at. If you'd like more details, please feel free to contact us. So I think that's a really comprehensive resource that you could take a look at. Great,
thank you. Here's another question. Karina, you mentioned mobile apps being accessible, and that's of great importance. Is WCAG 2.0 a concern for making them accessible, or is that something 2.0 points to?
Could you repeat that? I didn't catch that fully.
So this is just in relation to mobile apps. You had touched on how it's important for them to be accessible. Is that something that falls under WCAG 2.0, or is that a WCAG 2.1 concern?
So
WCAG actually I'm sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead, you started.
I was going to say that WCAG actually covers web content, but you can apply the principles to native mobile apps, and we also offer courses on that. Paul, did you want to give some more detail?
Yeah, it's just not, the WCAG guidelines themselves they're written in a way that could be applied to the web, could be applied to documents, digital content of all kinds. They do lean towards the web, but there's no explicit reference to native mobile apps per se, but they can apply. In fact, the W3C has put together some reference materials that show how WCAG can apply to the web and documents and even native software for desktop. They wrote it that way to be technology agnostic on purpose, but it does admittedly lean more towards the web, but there's no explicit reason why you can't use it for other technologies.
Great. And I know we're a few minutes over, folks, but we have a couple of questions still left, and so I think we're just going to keep on answering those for a few more moments. So the next one is the Trusted Tester program only for government employees, and how might people go about becoming a trusted tester?
So the Trusted Tester is actually open to anyone, and you can go through a number of courses and receive certification. If you just do a quick Google search, how do I become a trusted tester, you can find the exact steps and the exact courses that you need to take.
Perfect. And then another question we had was, do you have any thoughts on the use of ICT versus EIT?
EIT was the term that was included in the original Section 508, so don't be confused if you see EIT and ICT. So going forward, we recommend referring to things as ICT just to keep aligned with the refresh, but it's really the same thing. But going forward, use ICT.
Great. Okay. Are federal contractors generally held to both the level of A and AA standards for their products?
Yes, Section 508 refresh has been implemented for WCAG A and AA, yes.
Perfect. Thanks, Laura.
And maybe to add on to that, this is Paul Bowman again. The contractors, it's the way the law is written, the contractors are not the ones directly responsible. It's the federal government entity. But during the process of writing the contracts, the federal government entity is supposed to include accessibility. That's what ropes in the federal contractors. So the federal contractors, by virtue of the requirements on the federal government, have to abide by Section 508 in order to meet the contracts and their responsibilities for the government. But it does cover both A and AA. That's true.
Great, thank you, Paul. So it looks like questions are slowing down. So I think with that, we'll start wrapping it up. Thanks to everyone who has joined for today's webinar. Here is a slide of helpful resources that we've compiled. Again, the slide deck and recording will be sent out. DQ also has a couple of free resources that can help you get started with your Section 508 process and becoming compliant. One is Axe, which is our free Chrome or Firefox browser extension. It's an automated testing tool that will do an audit on your web page. And then DQ University is also free for individuals who have a disability. We offer scholarships to all of our online courses. So if you are a person with a disability and you want to take advantage of this offer, this is a great way to get involved and start learning more about accessibility. So those are a few ways to get started. And then this is going to be a webinar series. So we are, the next version of this series will be talking about Agile accessibility in Section 508. So stay tuned for that. We'll probably be announcing that relatively soon. I want to give special thanks to Karina, Lora, and Paul for doing a great job on presenting and for the questions. And we will be hosting webinars in the future soon. Thanks everyone for attending. Bye.